All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at one of history's absolute greatest ironies, an absolute monarchy actively orchestrating its own destruction just to win a proxy war. You know, we often think of historical events as these neat, isolated chapters in a textbook, but that's not how it works at all. Today, we're going to look at the American and French revolutions as one continuous, catastrophic chain reaction. We're talking vengeance, covert ops, and a literal infection of ideas that brought down an entire empire.
Here's our roadmap for this one. We're going to hit empire, republic, and parasites, then vengeance against the British, the covert proxy war, the billion-lever debt, the ideological contagion, and finally, the fall of the host.
Section 1. Empire, Republic, and Parasites.
Okay, so to properly understand 18th century statecraft and the true nature of proxy wars, we actually need to take a quick detour into a pretty terrifying biological reality. Meet the zombie ant fungus. Now, what's really wild about this parasite is that it doesn't actually invade the ant's brain. Instead, it surrounds the muscle fibers all over the ant's body. It essentially controls the host's limbs peripherally, almost like a puppeteer yanking the strings of a marionette, right? The fungus manipulates this poor host to serve its own reproduction, and then completely destroys it. So keep that image of the puppeteer and the doomed host in your head.
We actually see this exact dynamic reflected in modern pop culture all the time. Think about how George Lucas famously framed the Republic and the Empire in Star Wars. It's essentially a struggle where a totalitarian parasite hollows out a democratic host right from the inside. Well, we're going to use this exact biological and cultural metaphor to examine a real-world historical infection. Only in our story today, the roles are completely reversed. It's the absolute empire that suffers a parasitic capture by the ideals of the Republic.
Part 2. Vengeance against the British. Let's meet our main historical host, the absolute monarchy of France under King Louis XVI. Coming off a deeply humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War, the French crown was absolutely desperate for revenge against the British Empire. But look at this contrast. It's literally the ultimate paradox. On one hand, you have the famously extravagant, intensely Catholic, thoroughly aristocratic French monarchy. And on the other, a bunch of rural, largely Protestant upstarts shouting no taxation without representation. Let's be clear, King Louis harbored absolutely zero democratic sentiments. None. Yet purely out of geopolitical spite, he actively decided to fund a democratic uprising that stood against literally everything his own absolutist monarchy represented.
And you know, it's not like he wasn't warned. The king's own finance guy, and Robert Jacques Turgot, fought tooth and nail against this intervention. He delivered this chilling, dead-on prophecy to the king: the first gunshot will drive the state to bankruptcy. He knew France's finances were incredibly fragile, but the foreign minister completely talked over him, convincing the king that the geopolitical reward of crushing the British Empire was, absolutely worth the risk. Spoiler alert, it wasn't.
Section 3. The Covert Proxy War.
So France couldn't just declare war on Britain on day one without sparking a massive global conflict. Instead, they essentially infected the colonies with covert support. The idea was to let the Americans bleed the British first, and the methods they used were incredible. They actually set up a fake front company, Rodrigue Houteles & Co., just to funnel millions in weapons and gunpowder to the rebels. Get this, by the time of the critical Battle of Saratoga in 1777, it's estimated that up to 90% of the arms used by the Americans were supplied by the French. 90%! And once the Americans proved they could hold their own, France dropped the act, signed formal treaties in 78, and sent in their rebuilt navy along with thousands of elite troops.
Part 4. The billion-lever debt.
Now, this whole strategy absolutely worked on the battlefield, right? It culminated in the British surrender at Yorktown. But back home in Europe, our historical host was starting to show the first fatal symptoms of the infection. 1.3 billion livres. The French spent an estimated 1.3 billion livres on this 5-year proxy war. That isn't just an expensive military campaign, that is a number so staggeringly massive it completely snapped the structural spine of the royal finances. Because the French elite were mostly tax-exempt, the government had to fund this whole adventure through foreign loans at these increasingly insane interest rates.
I mean, just look at how the math completely stopped working. By the 1780s, an astounding 55% of all French state revenue was being swallowed whole just to pay the interest on the foreign loans they took out to fund the American Republic. Over half their money was just gone before they even paid a single soldier or paved a single road. The financial host was literally being eaten from the inside out.
Section 5. The ideological contagion.
While the financial hemorrhage was bad enough, the second fatal symptom was way more insidious. Just look at how rapidly this timeline progresses. Their pursuit of vengeance in 1763 quickly mutates. They ally with the Americans in 78, win at Yorktown in 81, and a mere 8 years later, in 1789, the Bastille is stormed. The very act of fighting for American liberty massively accelerated the timeline for France's own absolute monarchy to be torn down.
And here's the really crazy part. The French troops coming back across the Atlantic, they weren't just returning soldiers. They were actual physical vectors for a brand new political reality. Data shows that regions in France with higher numbers of returning American combatants saw significantly more revolutionary activity just a decade later. Discharged commoner soldiers went back to their local villages and started inciting resistance against feudalism. Meanwhile, you had elite officers, like the Marquis de Lafayette, who became massive national heroes and used all that fame to legitimize the push for constitutional reform right in the heart of Paris. The Comte de Ségur, who was one of those returning officers, totally hit the nail on the head. He noted that the men brought back a lively passion for freedom and for independence. These returning veterans were completely infected with the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality that they had just literally shed blood for. They had successfully fought against a monarchy in the Americas. There was no way the archaic feudalism of the Ancien regime was going to survive unchallenged once they got home.
And finally, Part 6, Fall of the Host. So let's tally up the final score here, because the irony is just off the charts. Great Britain lost the war and their colonies, yet their economy actually boomed shortly after because of renewed American trade. The United States won their total independence, sure, but went completely bankrupt in 1783. And France? Well, France successfully birthed the Republic and finally got to humble their British rivals. But the resulting financial ruin and the ideological revolt entirely consumed the absolutist French state. Just like that zombie ant we talked about at the beginning, the host accomplished the mission only to be totally destroyed by the very thing it nurtured.
So I'll leave you with this to chew on. History shows us time and time again that the weapons, the money, and the ideologies we export to fight our enemies, well, they almost always find their way back home. The French monarchy thought they were puppeteering a rebellion to secure their own power, completely unaware they were literally funding their own execution. It really makes you wonder, when superpowers engage in massive proxy conflicts today, who is really pulling the strings and who is the host? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.